This is the Leadership in Insurance podcast, brought to you by FinPro Search Partners.
Insurance companies are businesses and they need to look for the long term and be sustainable.
We went from 0 to 1 and now it's going from 1 to 100.
Insurance as a concept, as a kind of service, is brilliant. The execution is what we're looking at now.
I think the companies that are going to succeed are the ones that are going to understand and master the art of intent.
When we talk about innovation, we lean too heavily to think about technology and we don't think about creating a culture of innovation.
I think innovation is essentially continuous improvement of existing processes and platforms and product.
Right? It's got to be easy. It's got to be seamless.
Hello and welcome to the Leadership in Insurance podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bond, and I'm very lucky today to be joined by Henri, who's CEO and co-founder of Nomain. How are you, my friend? Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Alex. It has been a while. I'm very good.
It has been a while. Yeah, it has been a while. Yeah, because we met at ITI in London, didn't we? I think that was the first time we spoke.
Yeah, I think it was the first warm day of the year, even for you guys. Now it's very much the same theme that we always meet when it's very warm.
Yeah. I'll have to invite you over when I'm going to start my holiday, and then I know that I'm going to get good weather. But yeah, I think those guys at InsurTech Insights must have a deal with the devil, because it's like really it's quite early in the year and it's always hot. And like I think last year everyone was out on the lawn drinking champagne, and this year everyone's out on the lawn drinking Aperol Spritz. So yeah, it was great weather. But look, thank you for joining me. We had a really interesting conversation. I think you've got a really interesting take on the business, and I think it's a different take to some of the conversations we've had around a similar subject. So, but why don't you give the audience a bit of context? It'd be great if you can introduce yourself and obviously the main business.
Yeah, so I'm Henri, as you already said, CEO and co-founder of Nomain, and like the company and my background, they are tied together. So I studied AI already starting 2014, which turned out to be a good decision. But after that, I was a AI consultant. I was also working with banks and insurance companies. And even though my work was really far away from mainframe stuff, if you work with these large organizations, there is really no way of getting around the topic of mainframe. So then I ended up like asking, for example, from data sets from the mainframe people, for APIs to those data sets and so on. And they always said that, well, you can't have them because we have work until 2026 or something like that. And I clearly saw that, okay, there is some kind of a bottleneck in the mainframe team. And I dug into that topic a little bit more and found that they were always talking about one specific person, and mostly it was Jorgen in the organizations I was working with in the Nordics. And Jorgen was a guy who was in the company for 40 years and he knew that specific system very well. And not only did he knew that system, but then also like the policies, the business side. He knew all the people. He knew who to ask about specific things and so on. So he was essentially like a knowledge platform. So everyone could go to him, ask their questions, and always get a really grounded, knowledgeable answer. And the problem obviously is that Jorgen was not very scalable, so he became the bottleneck. But then also he's now 65 or plus years old, so he's about to leave the company. So 2 years ago, then we decided, okay, we'll do something about this specific problem and created Nomain to solve this. So basically creating a AI version of Jorgen, which is a knowledge platform specifically for companies running mainframe systems. So here we are.
Here we are. And that's what I find really interesting about this, and I think it's an angle that we've not talked about enough. We talk around it all the time, and we'll get into some of the things like rates of change and culture and all those. But I sometimes find it's a sort of there's this slight naive conversation that starts with going, well, just we need to move to, for example, earlier it was like move to cloud, and then everything needs to be cloud based, and then everything needs, essentially we talk about change and technology and the application of things like AI, in a perfect environment, like conceptually almost. Whereas the reality of doing some of this work is that you're dealing with things like mainframe systems and you're dealing with bottlenecks of knowledge in those businesses.
Hmm.
And so I think your addressing point is really interesting. As a side note, do you sometimes, you're in the industry a bit more now, you're in these rooms, you're in these conferences. Do you agree with that point? There's almost like sometimes talking in a perfect world. It's like talking about supply side economics. It's like, yeah, it works in a lab, it doesn't work in the real life.
Yeah, definitely. So like there's so many different, like if there wouldn't be any rules in insurance companies and banks, I think or like procurement, then like security rules and so on. Like I think 80% of stuff would have been already automated to some
Yeah,
extent, or
yeah.
at least there would have been like various attempts to do that. But then the reality, there are so many different boundaries, both organization, like cultural, but then just rules. So,
Mm,
for instance, we just a couple of weeks ago we found very interesting Confluence pages yeah, for a specific customer for a specific project. So then we were, hey, like we found those. Maybe it would be interesting to just have an integration from Confluence to our product. And like Confluence does have APIs, it does have an MCP, so does our product. So technically, it is minute of work. But then, because the in the PAP process, product approval process, we didn't tick the box that we will make integrations to that specific systems. We can't do that unless we go through that process again, which is again like so much work. Someone needs to drive it in the organization. Like then it's a delay. It is additional work. Someone needs to do it, and that's just like keeping these companies back
mm,
from reaping the full benefits of what is technically possible. Obviously, I
mm,
understand there is good rules for those
mm,
or good reasons for those rules, but they're
mm.
definitely slowing technical advancement. But then,
Yeah.
sorry, this is becoming pretty long. But then the culture is also like a huge part of it. So you can imagine uh, that if you work at the insurance company, you're not the manager. You're just doing your work, and you have been doing it for, let's say, 10 years in a specific way, and then someone comes along with an AI tool saying that "Now you need to use this because we need to be more efficient." Then I'm like, insurance is a very stable business. So for that specific like one individual working for an insurance, it's like, why would I need to be more efficient? Does my pay increase if I am more efficient, or do I save the company from going bust if I'm more efficient? Like there is nothing in that deal for that individual working for the institution. So there needs to be some kind of an incentive program for people to be more efficient. Otherwise, they will be doing the work like they're used to, and not do the change.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, I think culture's a huge thing, and I think we'll dive deep into that a bit later as well. But yeah, it's interesting. I just suddenly was struck by this kind of perfect environment, which is why, I think there's been a celebration of like net new insurance businesses. That's probably why there's some insane money going into these kind of net new insurers, carriers. But even 5 years down the line, you create legacy debt. It's the nature of having a business which has scale and size. But I'm just getting distracted slightly because I want to just drill into like, so let's get into what Nomain actually does, and what does a knowledge layer on top of a mainframe do for an insurer? What's the reason to move towards this direction?
Yeah. So really the Jorgen story from the start, that's essentially what we do. So we try to recreate that what Jürgen was able to do for that organization. So provide grounded, trustworthy information, both for technical and non-technical people. And how we do it is that we analyze the mainframe code first, and then adjacent systems, which is often .NET or Java. And that becomes basically the scaffolding for all other information. So let's say we analyze on top of the code a document. Then we don't just throw it into some kind of a data lake or something like that. It is contextualized in the context of the code. So then if the code changes, then we know that okay, this document is not anymore valid necessarily. Like there could be now some kind of a mistake because like the code doesn't do the same thing anymore. And that's kind of the power of contextualizing information to the code of an organization, because that's how you can keep all of the information that you have on that platform up to date with what the reality is. And I always say that there is basically three realities in large organizations. So there is the document reality, there is the tribal knowledge reality, and then the reality what the code actually does, which is like most of the things that a company actually does is also implemented in code to some extent. And what we try to do is bring all of those realities together, because right now those realities are often very much detached.
Mm. I thought that was a great. I'm gonna I'm gonna borrow that tribal uh, the tribal reality of things because
So,
yeah, I was talking about that this week because we've got lots of more remote structured businesses. You don't really build that, and some of that stuff's really useful. And technology has changed the way we work, and therefore there's some of that is shouldn't be required. It does change the way that people work and share information, and it means a change in kind of the behavior of that, which is much harder to do. Um, in a slightly related note, I wanted to talk about insurance versus banking because it's an advantage to have you on. I know you've worked with financial services and banking and insurance, but when they talk about them, they often get put together quite lazily. Everyone says, "Oh, banking and financial services," um, but you've drawn a clear distinction between the two, and this comes from a prior conversation we had. But insurers rely on batch processing in a way that banks don't. What does that distinction mean in practice when you're trying to modernize these businesses?
yeah, like the distinction is not that clear. Like it's still kind of very similar systems,
Mm,
but
mhm,
in general, if you think about what is the state of the IT landscape of these companies, is that banking has been modernizing for a much longer time than insurance, and it is mostly because of exactly this batch processing, that insurance is still able to do more. So like most of the mainframe system, they are batch systems. So every night or every week or every month, you can run workloads or some calculations in a large batch. So let's say during a day, you collect new insurance policies that people have been buying, and then they don't expect that you can see, or like a customer doesn't expect that they can see their insurance policy right away somewhere in real time. And there is also no need. You can just like have a placeholder in the web front end that, okay, you now have this insurance. And then it really, like the data is stored into the core system in the nightly batch or the weekly batch. And it doesn't matter that it's not real time. But then in a bank, um, on the other hand, in a bank, when you check your app, like banking application on your phone, like how much money do I have in my bank account, that needs to be real time. So like it needs to be the current amount of money in your bank account. So that is already a action where you need access to the core system in real time. And that's where mainframes really struggle. So having that sort of a service available for millions of people in real time. And that's why banks have been modernizing much more than insurance companies to get around of these limitations. So that's why when we go to an insurance company, there's mostly people are still developing in like a black screen. So meaning that they only see a black screen with white text, and that's directly connected to the mainframe where they have their code and they test the code and everything inside of this really kind of rudimentary developer experience. But then when you go to banks, they already use VS Code, they use a bunch of different extensions there, and it's just a more modern environment. But
mm,
definitely, I think insurance has been definitely moving towards the same kind of state where banking already is, because it is just like you can't go that much longer in that form without running out of people who can actually work in that way and with those technologies.
Yeah, it's an interesting note on that. Obviously, I work in the recruitment industry, and uh, we we actually don't do developers and don't do tech. We do C-suite CTOs and CPOs, etc. But we won't touch the devs. But I was talking to a friend of mine who does technology recruitment into the insurance space, and there was a spike in the day rates of like these developers that worked on the old systems because there's just a scarce resource, and it's very rare that you get a requirement for that. But then when you did, like it was incredibly expensive, as naturally it would be because there were so few people working, which is sort of a kind of weird quirk of technological development that the people left behind are important. But I want to stick with the developers actually, and you touched on this at the top about culture. And you and I had quite a long conversation about this before, and I think it's about most innovation, but the clear biggest modernization barriers are probably cultural rather than technical. Bringing people along on the journey with you. You know, you have to incentivize people to do this. Um, how have you? How do you think about that being done, and bring them on this journey rather than alienate them? And I suppose, have you seen it done well? Have you sort of had any lived experience of this as well?
Yeah, I can only talk about my experience,
Of
uh,
course.
and it's definitely that is the hardest part in the end. Techies like me, we tend to think that okay, the technology is so difficult to get working in a way that it's really providing value, but it's really not. You always can figure out technology, but then the culture is the real challenge.
Mm.
So I already touched upon the like what is the incentive of someone who is so-called just an employee of a insurance company. So like what is the incentive to be more efficient? And mostly there is no incentive scheme, for example. There is no kind of not even some kind of a threat that okay, everyone has to try these new tools out and be more efficient, or else something happens. So that's kind of the setting. So what we do is that we go to those people and then ask, what are the things that you really hate in your job? Like, what are the most boring and tedious tasks? And then we make sure that our tool, our platform really supports those tasks very well. And then it also flows into their workflow really well. And so we make sure that we understand what they actually do and how does their actual work day look like. What are the tasks that they do? What are the tools that they use? And make sure that our tool integrates into that as efficiently as possible. And then so that's about AI tools in more general. But then when you talk about modernization, there you have to again be more empathetic of the people that you need support from, and those are the mainframe developers, especially the really experienced mainframe developers. So imagine that you have been building a system for 40 years. You have been optimizing it here, and you have made it really nice for the needs of that time, and you're really proud of that. It has been running for 40 plus years with very little downtime, very little mistakes, and so on. And then someone comes along and, okay, now we are going to tear this one down. We're going to move it to a cloud system that you don't understand anymore. So please help us do that. So you probably would feel a little bit annoyed by that, or then I come along and say that okay, I'm gonna make an AI version of you. So
Yeah, yeah.
what is the incentive for that person to really give that information and to help in that process? And there we try to really sit down with those people and make clear to them that okay, we are creating your legacy. That for example, we have this feature where we can do expert interviews and store that information in the knowledge graph in the relevant places, like again contextualized, and that is the kind of legacy of that one person who has given that information, so that they can think that if they now do this interview with us and give us this information, then 10 years from now, someone can ask a question that, okay, how is this specific process actually implemented? And then they get a answer back. And there it says that, okay, this information comes from Jorgen on this date because he had been working on that in 1984. And he needed to make it in this way because there was some kind of new regulation or whatever. So it becomes their legacy that lives on longer than they do.
I think it's quite interesting from a cultural perspective because I think that's what people are. Going back to what I do, people are very proud of their work most of the time, and people love talking about their jobs. I mean, this is the funny thing about my job. I ask questions of people, and people are very happy to talk to you about it, and they are protective of that knowledge, and yeah, embracing that as something that you refer to. Is there an actual Jurgen? Was the guy called Jurgen? That's what I'm intrigued
Yeah.
by. But yeah, I think it's a really clever way of dealing with it because yeah, you said about the reason to change. I mean, this is some of the thing I think about larger businesses, particularly publicly traded businesses. One of the conversation that I had with a lot of new entrants to insurtech was that if you're super profitable insurance carrier and you're CEO of that business, committing a huge amount of resource to innovation, change, technology, as opposed to giving a massive dividend to the shareholders,
Mm.
is not incredibly incentivized. So there's a cultural problem throughout most, particularly publicly traded companies, because the CEO really CEO tenures on average is something like 2 years these days. What's the incentive? And so trying to find clever ways of incentivizing people is like, what do people care about? Legacy is one of them, particularly when you're talking about legacy tech stacks. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge from the top down, I think. Um, you spoke to me about rate of change. I thought that's really important thing to talk about, and it goes hand in hand with all this. You said that people can also move too fast as too slow. Um, what does getting that wrong look like? And I suppose where going back to leadership, where do the leaders come in here? Where do they have part to play?
Yeah. Really, really good intro there to rate of change. And I think the main point is that it is bounded on both ends. So like if you want to achieve something, you can go too slow, but obviously also too fast. I think now it's obvious that you kind of go too fast. There are so many different like really public failures in some kind of a IT transformation or business transformation. And when you go like so the failure modes are like too slow or too fast, and the slow one I think is if you think about the IT modernization for insurance, that has been one of or the more common failure mode actually. You don't think about it because it has been basically a lack of any movement in that direction. And what I mean is that especially these mainframe systems, they have been operated in keeping the lights on mode. So like just minimum investment, you keep a really small team. Maybe there is one pensioner called Jorgen, as a consultant every maybe 2 days a week, keeping that system up. And it has been the idea that okay, this will be okay for forever. We just run it in this sort of keep the lights on mode, and make sure that we can pay that bigger dividend. So that is definitely not moving quick enough if you think about that you have to keep these systems running. And now it's very evident that okay, we haven't invested enough in these systems. And when you then start to think about the actual modernization, moving too slow would mean that you don't have momentum. You don't see the progress, and you don't gather enough knowledge inside of one team that is really good in doing that migration. So that would be like a failure mode for modernization and going too slow. Going too fast, that's I think very very obvious. So you have been pushing for a large change in the organization that the organization can't absorb So it can be also that it's just too big of a initiative, or then there are multiple different initiatives, so that you have some kind of a reorg, and at the same time you are doing a migration of the mainframe to the cloud. And those things together combined then is too much for the organization to absorb. So you need to find something like a rate of change between those two extremes that works for both. And there is like in this the optimum rate of change. I think that's a phrase coined by McKinsey and Oxford University. So they did a study of 5,000 large IT projects, and they found that in large IT projects, about 50% of them went over budget, and they always went above 50% over that budget. So it's also like really significantly over the budget. And the key point was that the longer and bigger a project is, the worse the extra budget need then is. So like if you have a huge project, it's more likely to go wrong. And the learning from that is that the incremental change, piece by piece, is the more safe option, and like statistically also you have a bigger chance of success. So you have a big project, try to divide it into like smaller pieces, make sure that you make a good job in each small piece, and then move to the next one. For a mainframe migration, it would look for, like, for example, that you focus on one domain, and make sure that you do a really good job in that domain in the migration or whatever transformation you do, and then move to the next one. And it's actually kind of funny that it is sort of like a startup. That the startup cliche is that you start up, you focus on a very niche kind of problem in the world, and you make sure that you fail fast. So you really focus on one problem. If it doesn't work, then you pick a different problem or slightly different angle for it. And that has been proven like a very good way of finding a niche in a market where there would be room for a new player. And that same kind of logic applies to whatever big project you have. So narrowing down the scope, focusing on one thing, or a narrower piece of your organization, and make sure that you do a really good job in that, and then move to the next one. So yeah, that's also where the leadership comes in. That rather than pushing for a larger and more ambitious plan, narrow down the scope and make sure that you do a good job in that.
Yeah. I couldn't help while you were talking, just think about all these huge government projects that the UK runs, and they're always like 400% of budget by the end, and you're like, where does that budget ever come from? But yeah, that's a problem for another day. I'm conscious of time, so but I did want to talk about that. Let's talk about this in reality, right? So you have been doing this. You've already done this work with a large Nordic insurer. What have these engagements taught you along the way about what successful iterative modernization looks like? I mean, probably what you just said, but did anything surprise you within that engagement as well that's come out of kind of the practical work that you've done?
Yeah, definitely. Like the surprise was that, yeah, I touched on this, that I'm obviously really excited about AI, and if there is a possibility of using a new AI tool for something, I try it out. So that was somehow when we started this, that was my idea, that when we launch a exciting AI knowledge platform into an insurance company, then everyone will just jump on it and try it out for different use cases and be super excited. And then when we first got the usage data, so how many people actually have been using it, I was almost shocked that what, like, barely anyone is using it. So that's why I myself made that realization that, okay, we from the start, even at the level of an organization, we cannot think that, okay, we just help everyone with everything. We need to focus on individual teams or tribes or squads, whatever they're called in a given organization. Make sure that we cater to their needs, make a really good solution for this specific group of people. And when we see good adoption in that group, then we move to the next one. And that has been definitely like the biggest
Mm.
learning.
Mm. Yeah, great, interesting. I think it's I was fascinated when I first spoke to you, and I think we're really talking about the real bones of an insurance carrier and all traditional. And look, there'll be some people saying, well, we're much further along the journey, but it's like I think people will be shocked how many are not. And how early at the stage they are. So fascinating. So thank you for coming on. But I always like to leave the last word to my guest and talk about. So let's talk about your business, Nomain. It was like, what can we expect to see from you in the next 12, 18 months? Is it geographic expansion? We're going to see you on the road at lots of conferences. What's in store for you guys?
We have been doing go-to-market to Germany this year, and that's gonna still be the focus for the rest of the year, so that we like again focus on one thing, one area really well. Try try to get like do that very well, and then go to the next one. Actually, the next one would be UK, and I've been having very good discussions already with some companies in the region, so I'm pretty optimistic about that too.
Yeah.
But like tech-wise, I'm really looking like excited about the advancement of open source large language models. So for a company building in Europe, and especially for regulated organizations, so sovereignty, that is, I think, a small mega trend, if you can call it that. That we want to be in control over what models we use, and in what kind of ways they're used and where the data is flowing. And also, that's the promise that we make to our customers. So I'm really excited that the open source large language models are getting so much better, that it's actually possible also for European companies to deliver that sort of a promise.
Yeah, great. That sovereignty base is that's a whole new hour of the podcast. So
Yeah, definitely.
I'm gonna pick that up with my next guest. But Henry, thank you so much for making the time, and really thank you for being a guest on the Leadership and Insurance podcast.
It has been a blast. Thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you.